We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina. Thank you for being with us for this important conference titled The War in Ukraine, Lessons Learned and the Future Political Settlement. I'm Larry Valero, the department head for Intelligence and Security Studies here at the Citadel. This conference is a wonderful partnership between the Network for Strategic Analysis and the University of Naval, Sciences Po, and the European Initiative for Security Studies, and of course, the School of Humanities and Social Sciences here at the Citadel. I would like to thank my colleagues, Hugo Meyer and Jonathan Paquin, our Fulbright scholar here at the Citadel, for organizing this most timely event. Thank you all as well to our distinguished panelists and chairs and our keynote speaker, Michael Kofman, for their participation. Many thanks must also be given to Dr. Brian Jones, our Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Citadel, for his critical support. We also appreciate the great assistance provided by the Dean's office, including Jessica Galvin and her team. Again, thank you for all of you for your attendance and participation. If you are here in Charleston, please enjoy our historic campus and beautiful city. If you are joining us remotely, please come and visit us at the Citadel in the near future. You are most welcome. Have a great conference and a wonderful end to your week.
So, well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Hugo Meyer. I'm the director of the European Initiative for Security Studies and the research fellow at Sciences Po. I'm extremely pleased and very excited to kick off this conference today. I really would like to stress that I'm very grateful to the Network for Strategic Analysis and to the Citadel, and specifically to Jonathan and Larry for co-organizing this hybrid event, which of course is physically hosted at the Citadel. And as you all know, today marks an important but also sad anniversary, namely 1 year of brutal battles and heavy losses following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that's exactly 1 year ago. And this war constituted a major shock to Europe's security architecture as it marked a return of conventional warfare on the European continent. And so the overarching goal of this conference is to take stock of the main military lessons learned from the war in Ukraine, and to evaluate the possible future political settlements that may emerge from such conflict. And so to do so, the conference is organized in 2 roundtables with truly outstanding speakers and chairs. The first roundtable will analyze the key military lessons learned from the Russian, Ukrainian, and NATO's performances, because a lot of people, since the war in Ukraine, the invasion, have been very quick to dismiss Russian armed forces as incredibly weak or incompetent and disorganized, therefore arguing that Russia poses no real threat to Europe. Now, to be sure, Russia may be and is actually weaker in several areas than what we expected prior to the war, but the real challenge today is how to make sure that we do not overestimate the Russian military challenge while not underestimating it either. And of course, it's also crucially important to understand Ukrainian military performance and Ukrainian remarkable societal resilience, as well as the role of Western support to Ukraine. So what this roundtable will do is to provide a more nuanced and granular analysis of the military performances in this war across a wide range of domains, including military operations, training, logistics, intelligence, and nuclear deterrence, looking at strengths and weaknesses. The second roundtable then explores the prospects of a future political settlement between Russia and Ukraine and the roles of US and European powers therein. building on the scholarly literature on war termination, conflict resolution, and post-conflict resolution. The idea is really to evaluate the possible diplomatic settlements and scenarios that may emerge from this war. And so the overarching purpose is really to enrich our understanding of the post-war effort, its current trajectory, and the prospects for a peaceful political settlement. I really want to thank all the chairs and the speakers for taking the time to share their analysis and insights. And we're also truly honored that Michael Kofman accepted to deliver the keynote speech to kick off this conference. Michael has been for a long time one of the most influential analysts of Russian armed forces, and that's probably even more so since the invasion of Ukraine. Before leaving the floor to Jonathan, just a few words about the EISS, so the European Initiative for Security Studies. So its goal is to provide the largest network and forum for scholars in the field of security studies in Europe. And to do so, we organize a variety of initiatives. We have an annual conference every year in a different European country on a rotational basis. This year is going to be in Spain, Barcelona in June. We have a summer school, Euroswamos, for early career academics. That's in Berlin in July at Hertie School. We also have annual workshops, policy workshops between scholars and EU and NATO officials, and that's in Brussels, together with the NATO Defense College and the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy. We're launching a new project on coercive strategies of states with the first workshop in Florence in Italy at the end of this year. And last but not least, online and hybrid events just like this one. So really through these various projects, we are aiming to consolidate a truly European field of security studies. So I'll stop here. I hope that you will all enjoy this conference today. And Jonathan, I give back the floor to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Hugo. So my name is Jonathan Paquin. I am a Fulbright Scholar here at the Citadel this year. It's wonderful to be here with all of you this morning. On behalf of the Canadian Network for Strategic Analysis, to whom I belong, it is a great pleasure to co-host this conference with the European Initiative for Security Studies, as well as with the Citadel's Department of Intelligence and Security Studies, as well as the Citadel's Department of Political Science. Exactly 1 year ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. Before the invasion, many observers, I would say probably the majority of them, did not believe that the invasion would be carried out. They believed that Putin's maximum pressure strategy was paying off, actually. And in the context where NATO allies did not appear united and were basically recovering slowly from the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, nobody really thought that Russia would invade Ukraine, at the exception, of course, of some people, especially in the United States, but we didn't see it as a likely outcome for most of them. Then following the invasion, most of us believed that Kyiv would fall within 48 to 72 hours, and that the government of President Zelensky would either be crushed or forced into exile. Then 2 days later, President Zelensky turned down a US offer of evacuation from Kyiv. He famously responded to the US administration, "Well, the fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride." Who would have thought a year ago that Ukraine would rally the Western democratic states to its cause? Who would have thought that the Ukrainian army would get billions of dollars in arms and equipment from NATO members, including from Canada, and all kinds of training? Who would have thought that the Ukrainians would not only resist the Russian invaders, but that they would take back territory by forcing the Russian army into retreat in some eastern parts of Ukraine? So what happened? How is it possible that the reality on the ground exceeds the wildest dreams that many of us had in the hours following the Russian invasion a year ago? The war in Ukraine marked the return of major interstate wars on the European continent. This war is most probably the first of a new era, an era in which the international system is more confused, more unpredictable, and definitely not unipolar. The world has become a fertile ground for dissatisfied and revisionist states to seek gains at the cost of instability and human lives. I would like to thank our panel chairs as well as our panelists who have so graciously agreed to participate in this conference. As you have seen on the program, we have an outstanding lineup, and I can't wait to hear their takes on this war. So I thank you all, and I now turn to Hugo Meyer, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Have a wonderful conference to all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. So, well, as I mentioned before, we are very lucky, privileged, and honored to have Michael Kofman delivering the keynote speech today. Michael, as I mentioned, is one of the most robust and influential analysts of Russian armed forces today. He is the director of the Russia Studies program at the Center for Naval Analyses. He's also a fellow at the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington, D.C. Michael was born in Ukraine, in Kiev, and his research focuses on Russia and the former Soviet Union with a specific expertise in Russian armed forces, military thought, capabilities, and strategies. And he's also senior editor at War on the Rocks, where he publishes regularly. And his podcast, together with Ryan Evans, has been a unique source of insight and analysis for anyone interested in the war in Ukraine and in Russian armed forces. So Michael is truly the perfect keynote speaker for this event. It's a great pleasure, and again, a privilege and an honor to have Michael here with us today. So without further ado, Michael, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks for that kind introduction. Good to be here with you today. Sorry I can't be there in person, so I'm doing this virtually from the greater Washington, D.C. area. I hope you can hear me okay. My plan actually is to do a little bit of PowerPoint and a discussion. Wouldn't be a defense conference without some PowerPoint involved. Let me speak about to this, and I want to talk maybe a little around 20 minutes, maybe a bit longer, and then try to save the rest of the time for Q&A. Now, just to be upfront, I don't think you can do any kind of base initial assessment or give a solid impression of the war in just 20 minutes. So this is going to be at best an imperfect effort. Let me talk a bit about kind of a broad overview, or at least how I periodize the war. From my perspective, you know, this war is played out with the first phase being the initial Russian invasion and attempted a regime change operation, occupation of Ukraine, from February 24th to March 25th, then the battle for the Donbass, which plays out from the spring to the summer all the way to July, followed by Ukraine taking the initiative and launching a set of concurrent counteroffensives that play out from end of August to the fall. Then begins a war of attrition with the battle for Bakhmut, battle for Crimea, and now what we are seeing is a Russian winter offensive that began in late January and represents sort of the second battle for the Donbass. And it's not a particularly successful offensive, but nonetheless, it's a bit of a replay of what happened in the spring. So brief overview, if you take nothing away from the talk, these are the points that I hope you might take with you. That's the bottom line up front. To me, at least, what I found most interesting or salient in looking back on this war were first that Russian political assumptions on Ukraine, how easy it would be to occupy, the fact that they didn't really expect Ukrainian resistance, and they heavily privileged their assumptions that Russian intelligence could deliver a whole host of things in the country, yielded an unworkable concept of operations and what in best can be described as irrational force employment. I think one of the biggest mistakes analysts like myself made is they sort of assumed that Russian assumptions on this war and war optimism would drive the actual invasion, but the planning would be handed over to the military, and the military would put together sort of a well-professionally organized joint force operation with a center of gravity and what have you. And that's not what actually happened. The assumptions closely dictated the military strategy. Second, the secretive nature of the operation meant that there was knowledge staggered throughout the Russian military, and it was also divided. And so a lot of things weren't prepared, weren't well organized, and the Russian military wasn't well set up for the operation to begin with. Third, what you saw here is actually very important, very useful for military analysis in general, which is the Russian military showed an inability to scale early on. Now, they adapted down the line, but scaling force employment is one of the biggest challenges any military can have. And to put it more simply, you know, what a military can do with 3 battalions or 2 brigades, they can't do with 150, okay? And many militaries, when they try to scale force operations, everything breaks. everything that is essential to enabling the war effort to integration starts to collapse. Communications don't work, logistics don't work, the organization isn't there to link intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance with fires and what have you. And so a lot of things that may work at the smaller scale, they break when you attempt to invade a country with 150,000 plus troops. And that's one of the hardest things to tell, by the way, as an analyst looking at any military, whether or not they can or can't do something that you actually have not seen them attempt in the past. Fourth, the Russian military invaded with a variegated force that was not particularly interoperable. It was a partial mobilization army by design, which did not mobilize, so it was missing a sizable number of personnel. To make up for that shortage, they mobilized personnel in LDNR, the occupied republics in Ukraine, and they brought along Rosguardia, the National Guard. And these were all kind of a mixture of forces that couldn't work together very well and hadn't worked together well in the past. Force structure and force design, I think, is essential. And it's a topic I look at quite a bit when reflecting on the Russian military. Is an article that I wrote with Rob Lee last spring and April called Not Built But for Purpose, looking at the decisions made in Russian force design and the trade-offs they made. And it fundamentally built a Russian military that was very ill-suited for this war, particularly for this type of war. And I'm going to get more into that in this presentation as the choices they made. And the last 2 points I make is that the Russian military had a real weakness in fundamentals at the level of training, leadership, and the force quality really wasn't there. And I think many folks like myself looking at it thought that improved significantly, and it had from 1990s and 2000s, but not nearly to the extent that the Russian military itself expected. And here's the truth: a bad plan is one thing, and a good army can, to an extent, try to compensate for a bad plan or a bad military strategy. But what the Russian military suffered from early on is very much having a bad plan strategy and also not having a particularly good army. And last point, that force was really missing some of the software. It is experience in modern warfare, the ability to conduct complex operations, and the organizational adaptations, right? They have the tools, but a lot of things that the military often might be missing that you can't tell very well just by looking at it is that they don't actually have the organizational structures to enable the processes they would need to fight in that way, even though they have the hardware, right? And it looks like they might be able to put it together. Okay, last comment before I kind of try to breeze through as fast as I can through aspects of the Russian campaign. There's a lot we don't know about this war. The early reports are often wrong. I encourage all of you to consume information rather critically. I often say, look, we're still debating what happened in World War I. We're going to be debating what happened in this war and why for a very long time. You know, so with that in mind, I just want you to approach this presentation, what I say here, critically as well. That is, it is a fair chance that some of the things I'm saying later on will have better evidence or a better sort of first cut at the history that will show that some of this needs revising as well. Okay, on the initial campaign. So it's clear the Russian leadership believed this would be a quick regime change operation, that they would be able to either overthrow, capture Zelensky within a few days. And they planned for around maybe 10 to 14 days of a total initial phase of war. I think a lot of this was incredibly ambitious and highly unrealistic for them. It seems from my point of view, the Russian leadership assumed they were trying to recreate a much larger version of the annexation of Crimea in 2014, having in no way adjusted their views on Ukraine since February of 2014, which is quite remarkable. Now, it also seemed pretty heavily influenced by prior Soviet operations. Operations like Danube, the sea invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, Storm 333, Afghanistan in 1979. But I'd also say that in many ways, the initial operation looked like a pretty bad effort to imitate aspects of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. And it looked a little bit as though a country had learned all the wrong lessons from aspects of that operation and was trying to recreate it in part. Now, to what extent this is a military effort early on that fails versus an intelligence effort early on that fails will still be debated, because it's clear that the Russian military had an assumption that the FSB would handle the cities, that they would be able to seize critical infrastructure, that they would be able to turn mayors and governors, and that when the Russian airborne got to the capital, that the FSB would be able to get in and deliver on some critical aspects of this plan. And folks like me in the run-up to the war understood that the intelligence side was sort of a known unknown. What could the Russians do? What were they banking on? Especially since it actually even wasn't military intelligence that was supposed to deliver this, but it wasn't clear how much of their belief system was built on fantasy versus something that they felt they'd built on the ground. I traveled to Ukraine myself and went through the Battle of Kiev with colleagues and people I knew who had fought in that battle, and actually talked about how there was a fairly extensive FSB ground game. There's a lot more to that story, I think, than we know. And while the Russian intelligence failed, I think the truth of it is that they actually really did try to deliver on a whole host of operations that didn't play out for them. Now, the Russian military invaded with a somewhat hollowed out force. There was no mobilization. Russian political leadership believed they didn't need it for this conflict. But the Russian military was fundamentally structured such that it had no real capacity for a regional large-scale war without manning being raised, and it couldn't deploy such a hollow force in sustained combat operations for a long time. So it's a very risky operation without much of a plan B. Russian troops in many cases were not aware of the actual mission until 24 to 72 hours in advance. It's clear that Russian senior officers knew some months out, and junior officers and maybe folks at the battalion command level probably knew a couple of weeks out. But that's not enough to conduct a large-scale invasion and to try to scale force employment in a way that the military hadn't done in, let's say, over 40 years. If you look at the basic logistics coordination, it really wasn't there. And a lot of Russian equipment in the run-up to the war sat out in the winter, waiting for Russian troops to arrive. And much of the maintenance and sustainment simply wasn't up to par. There's one area where I think the Russian military skimped. It was definitely there. But most importantly, when it comes to force employment, why it was bizarre and irrational, just from an analytical perspective. Russian troops drove in largely administratively, as though they were still in Russia. They pushed units quickly down roads, trying to conduct thunder runs, which is kind of a nickname we have going back to the Iraq War, attempting to seize key junctions and bridges while avoiding the main fights. It's clear they thought that cities would be handled by intelligence and by Rosguardia. Ironically, a number of these columns had Rosguardia and National Guard units in the lead. We have their actual force tables for the invasion as primary source documents. And it's clear that they were so confident there wouldn't be much resistance that their actual formations that run for many miles, with the National Guard being the lead part of the formations as opposed to the regular military, which may sound ridiculous to anybody looking at it, but I encourage you to check out some of the documentation that's been captured from this war. So logistics couldn't keep up. A lot of this fell apart. I think the Russian military suffered major morale issues. They had order confusion and a real loss of trust in their officers early on. I think part of the reason for that also is that whatever the invasion plan was, at the very outset, it very clearly became just about Russian forces trying to reach specific objectives by a particular timetable that apparently was highly unrealistic for them, right? And pushing as many units as they could down roads and splintering off from their logistics and leaving themselves completely open to counterattack, leaving the lines of supply exposed. The Russian military took heavy casualties early on amongst the best forces, most of the elite infantry. They became bogged down. They tried to adjust and essentially pursued the diffuse strategy, which I'll show in a moment on a map. And that diffuse strategy led them to pursue a campaign along three fronts with many competing axes of advance, where they were competing with themselves for forces. And they compounded the problem, I would say, in about three ways. So the Russian command and control in this operation was not reflective either of prior training and exercises, strategic command staff exercise, the way the Russian military trains and organizes to fight at the scale, nor of prior wars, that is, the way it invaded Ukraine in 2014 and 2015. So they were attempting something very different, with each military district being in charge of its own regional grouping of forces. And you essentially had four militaries in the fight, with the Air Force split between them without much unity of command or unity of effort. All right. Second, they were attempting to do this at a time when they were trying to scale force employment in the way that they hadn't done. And that really broke the system in two ways. They neither had experience organizing forces this way, nor did they have experience employing forces at this scale previously. All right. And the last point, and this goes back to force structure, they were attempting to use their force in a way it really wasn't meant for. which was not reflective of doctrine or training, both the way they actually organized the units in terms of the formations and how they invaded and drove into Ukraine, but also because Russian battalion tactical groups as formations were meant for local conflict and were never meant for a large-scale war, and they didn't have the sustainment or logistics built into them for that kind of operation by design. So here's the invasion perspective. The campaign varies depending on where you look, but clearly the Russian military was struggling to establish any military advantage because they spread themselves so thinly along different axes of advance and fronts that they had very little manpower to control terrain. They weren't attaining advantage anywhere. So you have no real massing of forces and no discernible center of gravity to the Russian invasion. And the reason for that is straightforward. Folks like me thought that the Russian concept of operation, the center of gravity would be first the Ukrainian military in the Donbass, the GFO. And if you look in the eastern part of the map, where there's kind of an empty space, the Russian military and LDNR units do pin the Ukrainian military in the Donbass and a large part of it. Okay. However, the center of gravity of the Russian campaign is actually the two axes attempting a decapitation strike in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. Folks like me thought that that would be more of a fixing action and that wouldn't be the weight of the Russian invasion, because there's no way that the Russian military could capture a city like Kiev with a population of 3 million people and one of the larger cities in Europe on that kind of timetable. And I myself am from Kiev. I'm actually from the left side of the riverbank of the city, so I'm quite familiar with it. And if you look at the southern part, which is where the Russian military had the most success breaking out of Crimea, they actually broke out along 4 different axes and they were competing with themselves for logistics and for forces. And part of the reason they were successful there was the availability of rail hubs, terrain, correlation of forces. But it's also clear that the Russian intelligence operation was much more successful in the south in Kherson because large parts of that territory seem to have been surrendered without a significant effort to defend. That's a disputed bit of history, but I encourage folks to look at it if you're studying this. So, and of course, a presentation on the Russian effort, but I think we have to say a few important things about Ukrainian efforts and success as well. So, although the Ukrainian military in some respects was out of a position during the initial Russian invasion, it's very clear that in the run-up to the war, in the last nights, they moved key military assets, units, air defenses, radars, in advance of the Russian strike, which meant that the initial Russian attack was much less effective than the Russian military plan. Second, Ukrainian volunteers and veterans showed up to fight and defend the capital and bought valuable time for Ukrainian units and brigades to get in position and to mobilize additional personnel. Third, Ukrainian forces fought a really effective mobile defense in the east, okay? Essentially beating the 1st Guards Tank Army, which ended up being a grossly overrated military formation. Fourth, while a lot of the videos and footage you might see on the internet suggest that anti-tank guided missiles and things like that were very important, at the end of the day, this is an artillery war. It has been an artillery war from the very beginning, and most of the casualties were inflicted by artillery. I think Ukrainian forces used anti-tank guided weapons provided by the United States and other countries effectively to slow down Russian advance. But if you look at where most of the casualties and the damage comes from, it is from effective Ukrainian use of artillery and fairly ineffective Russian use of artillery early on. That said, with all the shambolic aspects of the Russian invasion, I think an important takeaway is that this was actually not very overdetermined. It was a close run thing early on. A lot of it hinged on the first couple of days of the war. Zelensky choosing to stay, despite a number of his advisors suggesting to him that he should flee. It wasn't just Westerners that thought Zelensky was going to flee. There are many colleagues I have in Ukraine that thought in the first couple of days that the government might not hold. And this is why I say it's a lot closer run than you might expect looking back on this war today. Let me talk a bit about Russian force structure, because I think this is significant. So the Russian military in general, over the course of years of reforms and modernization and reforms to the reforms and walking back some of the reforms, generally pursued a military strategy that built a force that was organized around 2 ideas. A short, sharp war with NATO, where the initial period of war would be decisive, right? And what they thought was enough hedge in the force or flexibility to be able to generate high readiness units, but for something on the size of a local conflict or local scale war. The assumptions they had was that there wouldn't be a need for strategic ground defensives, that you don't need the logistics for that kind of ground force projection, and that you wouldn't need the manpower to hold terrain. right? That instead the focus was on fire and strike, air defense, key enablers. And what you basically have is you have a military that's organized around the idea that what's most important in war, okay, is precision strike, that the battlefield will be fragmented, that there will be high maneuverable formations engaging each other, largely without direct line of sight, focused around concepts like maneuver defense. And the reason for that is the Russian military assumed that on the modern European battlefield, nobody had the force density to hold static fronts, right? That there wouldn't be a replay of World War II or World War I style fighting. And that a lot of what mattered most in the initial period of war was actually air defense and aerospace attack, particularly because the United States is an expeditionary aerospace power and the strongest when it comes to air power. And if you don't have an answer for that, there isn't much of a point to kind of recreating yet another Iraqi military. So if you look at Russian force structure, it proved quite deterministic because the Russian military, after a period of reforms, then got addicted to partial mobilization and tried to build out a larger force structure going from brigades to division. And they started getting more and more metal, mechanization, armor, artillery, but without raising the actual size of the active duty force. So how were they able to square the circle? The answer is very simple. The readiness kept going down, and it started going down towards 70%. And it became fundamentally a partial mobilization army. And the Russian military told itself, well, that's okay, because each formation will be able to generate 2 battalion tactical groups with contract staff personnel on short notice in the event of any kind of contingency other than a regional large-scale war. But then they began to compromise on that idea too. And they kept expanding the number of battalion tactical groups they had on paper. And the way they were doing it is by cutting the actual size of the BTG. And what did they cut? And that's actually, to me, a very important aspect of something we can learn from this war, which is how force structure and your force design choices are going to affect the way you're going to fight, no matter what your concepts say. So they cut the infantry. They reduced the size of squads. They reduced the size of infantry companies and battalions. And they cut a lot of the infantry from Russian battalion tactical groups. And this is why the Russian military struggled with combined arms, because you can't do combined arms if you don't have infantry. They had a very hard time fighting for cities. They couldn't get vehicles off roads because there's nobody to screen them. And they couldn't hold sizable amounts of terrain that they were trying to capture because, again, they lacked infantry. And this proved fairly devastating, I think, to the Russian war effort. And they found themselves not only in a structural manpower deficit, because they didn't have the forces in practice to try to invade and occupy a country the size of Ukraine, but more importantly, they didn't have the right mix within those forces. And they invaded with a force that had a lot of artillery, armor, mechanization, infantry fighting vehicles, enablers, ISR, electronic warfare, but very little actual infantry and the other kind of units you would need to be able to fight for cities and hold terrain. And that's important. Drone units, electronic warfare units, they're not going to hold terrain for you. We talked briefly about the air campaign, which I think there's a lot of mythology around this. There's actually been far more Russian air power and Ukrainian air power employment in this war than many folks I think believe, but that's because it's the one aspect of the war that's the least visible through open sources. So it's very hard to tell what's going on, and it's still going to take a while to piece together what happened early on in this conflict. That said, it's pretty clear that from a standpoint of an air campaign, although it seemed that the Russian Air Force was missing in action, that's not really the case. The Russian Air Force started off by conducting a pre-planned strike campaign that was meant to be demonstrative use of force, assuming that Ukraine was going to surrender in the early days. And when none of that happened, they then tried to rapidly adjust to provide support to Russian ground forces, which themselves were bogged down and in deep trouble. But they hadn't attained any kind of air superiority or even localized air superiority, and quickly found themselves stuck between a choice of either being shot down at medium and higher altitude by Ukraine's radar-guided air defense or lower altitude by manpads. But why did this happen? So first, there was no Russian plan to really attain air superiority. That's very clear, for a very simple reason. An air superiority campaign over a country the size of Ukraine, with the amount of air defense that Ukraine had, and arguably Ukraine has far more radar-guided air defense than any other country in Europe, by far, would take many months. So it's not clear how that could be reconciled with Putin's desire to have the war basically be over within 2 weeks. All right. Second, I don't think the Russian Air Force could actually do it for a couple of reasons. Attaining air superiority over a hard target has never been a mission for the Russian Air Force, nor did the Soviet Air Force have any experience with it. The Russian Air Force is principally designed to support air defense and provide support to ground forces, okay? It has no experience in this kind of mission, no real training in it, not much in the way of specialized aircraft, fairly low availability of trained pilots, and pretty weak experience in trying to scale complex operations, and there's nothing more complex than suppression or destruction of enemy air defense. So, although they attempt to do this in pockets early on, you can see from the very first days of the war, they tried to suppress Ukrainian air defense. Ultimately, they're not able to do this. And the way I look at it is that the Russian Air Force found itself essentially relegated to providing combat air patrols and trying to secure the skies, but having very little capacity to deal with Ukrainian air defense. And eventually both air forces found themselves operating in a mutually air-denied environment, okay, where they were supporting from behind the forward line of troops. And that doesn't mean that they were irrelevant or ineffective. There were a series of air-to-air engagements starting from the very beginning of the war, and there's a lot more to unpack there. It just means the Russian air power was employed very differently from, I think, the way many would expect it, and certainly not in the way any Western Air Force might have been employed. From my own point of view, I think folks like myself expected that the Russian Air Force would conduct strikes to attack Ukrainian command and control, critical infrastructure, isolate the theater by taking out key bridges, and going after Ukrainian air defense early on. And the truth is that very little to none of that happened. And it's still a bit mystifying why. One of the possible explanations that people have is that because Russian leadership intended to occupy the country, that they actually wanted to leave much of the critical infrastructure intact. And they were so much stuck on their assumptions that there wouldn't be significant Ukrainian resistance, so that much of the Ukrainian military wouldn't fight, that they simply didn't have the Air Force organize this kind of campaign. And because a lot of Russian ground forces weren't very well prepared for the operations they were conducting, the Air Force wasn't coordinated with them. It didn't know where they were going to be because many of them didn't know where they were going to be either until a few days to the run-up to the war. Let me talk a bit about the follow-on phases. So, you know, after the initial defeat of the Russian campaign, the Russian military tried to reconstitute, pursue a campaign in the Donbass. There, they found themselves struggling with manpower. They began heavily leveraging the mobilized personnel from LDNR to compensate for all the elite infantry they'd lost. They became more dependent on Wagner PMC troops as well, starting in May of 2022. And they started reaching for volunteer battalions and battalions organized by various regions and republics or oblasts. But this in no way could compensate for the losses or for the fact that they never mobilized in the military to raise their manning tables. So the Russian military found itself progressing to the mean, which is leveraging artillery firepower as their advantage, compensating for a lack of manpower with fires. But this strategy also ran out of track eventually by July. I think that they pursued an attritional approach. And to be honest, Ukraine's fight was quite desperate looking back in May and June. And what became decisive there at the end of the day was Western material assistance, coming up with artillery, ammunition, and eventually providing HIMARS systems, which were used to reduce the Russian advantage in fire. So if you kind of look at the war starting from February through the summer, what's most decisive early on is Ukrainian will and determination to fight, right? And what becomes more decisive later on is that in combination with Western material support. My own view is that if it wasn't for the United States and other countries showing up to help Ukraine, that this war might have very well had the arc of the Winter War, 1939-1940. And probably the most significant aspect of U.S. assistance is not material, but intelligence support, because the U.S. reversed its policy on sharing intelligence to an extent that had, I think, real battlefield shaping outcomes fairly early on into the war. So this became, in many respects, an artillery war. Neither side had the forces or the quality of force to conduct combined arms maneuver warfare from the spring to the summer. But the Russian military became exhausted. It had no capacity for rotation. The force started to degrade, and they were slowly cannibalizing it. And they couldn't retain people because they hadn't declared a war in practice. So there were plenty of Russian soldiers that simply refused to deploy and fight. And they were bleeding manpower both due to casualties and due to refusals. And that put the Russian military in a tremendous vulnerability when you look at the lack of manpower they had to defend Kharkiv in September, with much of the force then concentrated to try to defend Kherson. Okay, that said, the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv was very successful, but didn't look especially repeatable because the deficit of Russian manpower there was so significant that the Russian military largely depended on Rosgwardia and LNR units. Whereas in Kherson, the Ukrainian offensive was ultimately successful, but it proved to be a grinding, bloody fight with fitful starts where Russian airborne was able to hold on for several months. And then eventually much of the Russian force withdrew with their equipment. Okay. I'm not going to talk about what's going on today. I think a lot of the conference is probably going to cover this. I'll close out on 2 brief slides here. They're probably already overrun my desired speaking time. But first are important factors, but what I think are not necessarily great explanations. So a lot of this I've heard in public discussions, in the press, and other colleagues raising corruption. So I think corruption is significant, but it's not that easy to price it in advance of a war. And the asymmetry in corruption between Russia and Ukraine is not that great. Most importantly, it's not really clear what corruption is specifically causal of. You have to have much better arguments than corruption. I find corruption to be kind of a often intellectual crutch and used as a hand-waving argument to explain everything. Well, Azerbaijan is 3 times more corrupt than Armenia, and Azerbaijan beat Armenia decisively in 2020. So we know corruption in and of itself, the asymmetry in corruption, is not causal of outcomes in wars, but is an interesting factor and input to explore. Next, well, I think kind of pseudo-intellectual explanations about societies and armies being reflection of them. I think these are stereotypical and essentialist arguments that we should try to avoid. I don't think they're the smartest arguments in the room, not by a long shot. They have a superficial appeal, but the more you think about them, the more problematic they very quickly become, especially if you take a historical lens on the implications of those kind of arguments. Technical minutia, who had the best tires and this sort of thing. To be honest, looking at the Russian campaign, you can see how a lot of things might aggregate, but these explanations are deeply unsatisfactory. And there are a lot of input-output problems in what we know about the Russian war effort over the course of the past year. For example, Russian logistics were poor. Okay, well, they were pretty bad early on in the war, but the Russian military sustained an average rate of fire of 20,000 artillery shells per day for much of last year, peaking at around 40,000 April and May. Well, artillery takes up a lot of your logistics, actually. It's artillery ammunition, followed by fuel, followed by food and supplies at the end, right? So if logistics were so poor, how are they consistently able to sustain such a rate of fire? These are the kind of questions I often like to ask, which goes back to, how do we know what we know? Are we sure about it? What are the indicators we would look or things that might falsify those hypotheses? So I basically discourage people from monocausal explanations like logistics. And last, intangibles, things like morale. Yes, they're very significant, right? But morale is hard to rate. As I often say, we call them intangibles because they're very difficult to account for with any rigor. And if they were easy to measure, then we would call them tangibles, and we could count them the way we count tanks or aircraft or artillery. And morale varies on the battlefield. It's very localized to a particular context. So defending force like Ukraine with the will to fight clearly has higher morale. Russian military may have lower morale, but it varies throughout the war. It depends on whether one side is winning or losing. It depends on where you are on the battlefield, how you're equipped and supported, and what have you. There's no such thing as, a constant level of morale across 2 forces that one can necessarily speak to in a smart way. I'll close out on this slide on kind of less future military analysis. Military power, from my point of view, is closely tied to context. There's no such thing as an abstract military power rating where US is number 1, China's number 2, Russia's number 3, right? So the Russian military in this context grossly underperformed relative to expectations. The Ukrainian military significantly overperformed relative to expectations. That's very fair to say, but you could see that some lessons you can generalize based on Russian military performance as to how they would do in a different war, but you have to be careful not to generalize too much because every war is its own separate context and battle with its own conditions, military strategy, and and actors. Political considerations are often predominant, and we tend to overlook them as military analysts because we assume that whatever the cause of the war is, the military operation will be a well-run, put-together, combined arms operation with logical objectives and rational force employment. And that just isn't true. You really have to build the political assumptions into your analysis of what you think the military campaign will be, all right? Military software is just as important as hardware. Russian forces may have had precision-guided weapons, and they had the means of ISR, but they had no experience conducting long-range precision strikes at scale, doing battle damage assessment, knowing what kind of weapons you need to service what targets, and going through a cycle, because they've never done it in a war like this. They've only seen countries like the United States do it, okay? And we make it look easy, but it's actually quite hard. Suppression of enemy air defense, again, very difficult. If you want to know how difficult it is, just watch Europeans try to do it without U.S. support. Is a good example. That's a bit of a quip. But to be perfectly honest, software is very important. Organizational adaptations to be able to engage in the kind of warfare you want to do, which is translate theory into practice, is one of the hardest things. Last point on this: defense research ecosystem definitely creates biases, right? We tend to overestimate opponents. And we tend to assume in wargaming that they're going to put a lot of things together that they may not necessarily be able to. And we tend to be very smart about the scenarios we look at and the war games we run. And we tend to be not very smart in assessing the potential matchup or the range of scenarios when we have contingencies that we're not really tasked to look at. And so you have to mind the bias that the defense ecosystem tends to generate, right? And often it looks much more at things like capability or prior wars or exercises, but it doesn't necessarily build out from force design what the real limitations of that military are going to be. And these things tend to be more important to assess. Okay, so with that, I will stop sharing. I'm happy to take some questions. Hugo, I'll turn it back over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Michael. This was really terrific. You covered a lot of ground and you really highlighted a number of key lessons learned from the war in Ukraine, and both at the political and military level, which I found extremely interesting. I have one question for you, and then I'll give the floor back to Jonathan. And the question is, and these are points you touched upon briefly, and could you zoom in on the lessons learned in two areas, which are training and intelligence? Because it seems to me that these are two very important areas that are sometimes neglected. I mean, Russia has displayed poor training. Western support in intelligence has played arguably an important role. So of course, there are limits to what we know, but I would be curious to hear more from you on these two factors: training on both the Russian and Ukrainian side, and then Western intelligence support. Thanks.
Okay, so on the training side, I think what I can say is that the Russian military, in terms of training and force quality, have substantially increased the number of exercises they were running, the operational tempo, and they were cycling officers and commanders through Syria, and they were cycling crews as well. So it looked like they were getting a lot of experience both in the war in Ukraine in 14-15 and in Syria, and had substantially increased the level of funding to exercise. But what was the content and substance of those exercises, right? And what the forces were really getting out of them, that remained to some extent a black box. And part of the reason for that, just to be clear, is because Russian military does basic training, qualification, certification differently than, let's say, the way we do, okay? They don't really have national training centers except for Molino, which got activated, I think, back in 15, right? In the Russian military, when you're a conscript or when you join the military, you do your basic training at the unit you go to, okay? So what is a good way to assess training that may vary across, 500 different Russian units, right? As opposed to, 5-6 main training centers where soldiers may go train in the West. So it was pretty hard to aggregate it, and there was anecdotal evidence showing both that there were a lot of problems in training and that the force quality wasn't as good, but also anecdotes showing that some of the forces were better. Long story short, Russian elite units weren't that elite, but more importantly, they weren't used in their proper roles. For example, Russian Airborne is a light maneuver mechanized force that was basically thrown into urban combat in Kiev with actually not much in the way of any kind of training for urban combat or for urban terrain. But in Russian regular units, I think were much more subpar compared to expectations. On the Ukrainian side, it's an interesting conversation. I heard very mixed takes on Ukrainian training from US folks that were there training them in the run-up to the war. It was a much expanded, reformed, and also modernized force, and it wasn't clear how it performed. Now, Ukrainian soldiers had a lot of veterancy rotating through the Donbass, but a lot of that was static fighting, largely indirect fire, right? So I think it's fair to say that the Ukrainian military ended up a lot better off than many of us expected. I would love to say it's because of Western training over the course of these years, but I don't think that's true at all, outside of special forces. I know we want to believe it's true, particularly in the US, because we're always kind of looking for a military that has done well and has done well because we train them. And that's just not the case. I don't think we should take credit for Ukrainian success. I don't think the Ukrainian military is more like the US military, okay? In many respects, from force structure, force design, it's actually much more like the Russian military. And I don't like self-validating lessons from this war. What I will say was more important from my own point of view, the kind of intangibles that I focus on, not so much things like morale, but military culture, which will always supersede doctrine and concepts of operations. That Ukrainian military culture is quite different from Russian military culture. And I don't think that's the result of training, because I don't think you can train it, okay? I think it's the result of both a desire to be different. I think it's partly a desire of perhaps different fundamental differences between the countries, but more importantly, I think it comes from years of interaction and exposure with Western countries, right? Ukrainian military leadership does not treat their troops as cynically in the same way the Russian leaders do. There's accountability in that system, okay? Initiative is rewarded. There's horizontal decision-making. There's a strong privilege towards veterancy and experience. And if you look at the systems, one of their biggest differences is military culture, not force structure, force organization. Okay, on intelligence support. So I'll put it this way. All I know is what's been covered in the press, and it's been covered extensively already, right? Which is that US intelligence from the early days of the war has been one of the important factors behind the scenes. And that's not to take anything away from the Ukrainian military effort, but just say that one of the big things that analysts like myself didn't know in the run-up to the war is that about a week or two into it, the United States would completely reverse its policy on intelligence sharing and support. And this would peak with US providing capabilities like HIMARS, whose employment consistently depends on US intelligence and support, right? And battle damage assessment and things like that, right? And that's been covered recently in articles as well. Right? So this is very much a Ukrainian effort, but we shouldn't pretend that, that the United States and other countries aren't heavily involved in supporting Ukraine in this effort either.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. We have another 5 minutes with you. Maybe I could, just ask a very quick question, but also I would like to invite all of you online to write down your questions using the Q&R tab. And that's, true for the entire, conference up until 12 o'clock. So do not hesitate to write down your questions. We will ask them if we can. Michael, very quickly, military-wise, from the Russian side, what are you expecting for the coming year? That's the first question. And can Putin mobilize more troops? I mean, how many times can you mobilize 300,000 troops? And so, I'm curious.
If you have 145 million, quite a few people, quite a few times, to be perfectly honest. These are very large countries, okay? Right. Ukraine has millions of people as well, right? And Ukraine's gone through many ways of mobilization. So let me take this question on. I think it's a really good question. Now, look, I'm not going to say I know what to expect. You should make predictions in this business. And as I always say, military analysis is not fortune telling, right? These things are very contingent. And if anything that this war teaches you from the very beginning is that the things you can assess and the things you typically select for as a military analyst only speak to potential. After that, it's the iterative interaction or dynamic interaction between forces that yields these outcomes, and they're very hard to predict. And that's a big lesson for me, as always. That's why I'm always frustrated whenever folks looking at this war start to declare a stalemate. There's no stalemate in this war. Wars go in phases, right? And in one phase you might have an offensive, then you might have an operational pause, then the other side will seize the initiative and what have you. Right now, what we are seeing is a Russian winter offensive. The Russian military was at its weakest heading into the winter. okay? Ukraine was very successful in the fall. Russian military used mobilization to stabilize lines, rebuild understrength units, and try to entrench itself, and was pursuing largely a defensive strategy, with the exception of the battle for Bakhmut. Okay, there was a change in leadership. Gerasimov came back in, advocated that the force was now strong enough to try to pursue a campaign to take the Donbass, which remains Russia's minimal political objective. I think that's clearly quite wrong. The Russian military doesn't have the force quality anymore. You can't replace experienced regulars with people you mobilized 3 months ago. They've lost way too many junior officers, which are the hardest things to replace. It's not general officers that they lost that are the problem. No offense to any general officers. My own view is they're much easier to replace than battalion commanders. So when you lose battalion and company commanders that had good training or some decent degree of experience, that's the part of the force you cannot replace in the span of several months. You can always promote somebody to be to a higher general officer rank. The other two big issues they have is quality of equipment, and most importantly, artillery ammunition. They use too much artillery ammunition to compensate for manpower deficit over spring and summer of last year. So they're either rationing now, they're going to have to ration pretty soon. So that's why this offensive looks pretty anemic. After it, I think we're going to see a Ukrainian offensive, most likely in the southern part of the country. That's very clear. When that'll happen, I don't know. Most people assume it'll be in the spring, right? One of the big things that shapes it is what comes of the Russian winter offensive. I think Russian military will make some incremental gains, but overall, I think it's going to be a very underwhelming operation. The biggest question is what the impact will be on the force. To what extent will it leave the Russian military vulnerable again and create opportunities for Ukrainian forces, which I think it will, but also to what extent it will create attrition and problems for the Ukrainian military, could force them to delay their offensive too. Because look, as an analyst, when you follow the war, you're often selecting for what you can see, which is territory trading hands, and you're not selecting for what's more important, which is what's happening to the two forces. And Kharkiv is a very, very good lesson in that, because the lines there were relatively static, but the Russian military was stretched too thin and pulled most of its manpower and deployed it to defend Kherson. And Kharkiv was left relatively undefended, and the units there were barely 30% manning. They were exhausted. Many of them wanted to leave. They had very low morale because of the situation. And a number of the units were not even Russian regulars, right? But the line hadn't changed up until September. So if you're just selecting for what you think is the line of control kind of on the map, right? War doesn't just come down to maps, and you're not seeing what's really going on with the force. And there are these sort of gradually then suddenly effects, where what you see in this war is that maneuver warfare has been mostly successful where it had been enabled by prolonged attrition. By itself, against prepared defense, it hasn't done very well. But the attrition is the hardest part to kind of see and difficult to track what it does to the force. So I hope this makes sense. Myself, I try to create mental markers looking several months out and try to look at indicators or trends for which way the war is going, rather than following it necessarily day by day, right? So I think a good point to look at is later in the spring, and then maybe towards the end of the summer.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael. This was a fascinating keynote address. We really appreciate your time.